Back in the 1990s, TBS, the network, gave us a Saturday morning cartoon called Captain Planet. So I don't know if any of y'all ever watched Captain Planet, but here's kind of the basic premise, and that is that the Earth, in the show, the Earth was being damaged by heavy pollution. And there were 5 powerful rings, and they were given to 5 teenagers. This is going to sound a little bit like Infinity Wars by Marvel, and it's not. It's totally different. But these rings were used to battle some eco-villains, the bad guys in the cartoon. And there were different elements that were designated to these rings, and they were earth, fire, wind, water, and heart. And some of the villains included Hoggish Greedley, Dr. Blight, Captain Pollution, Loot and Plunder, and Verminous Scum. And there were several others to add among those. And when things got bad, these teenagers could hold those rings up in the air and summon Captain Planet. And Captain Planet, there on the your left there, he would show up and he would save the day ultimately, and the bad guys would disappear. But believe it or not, there's some debate among super fans, of which I'm not, okay? I watched the show a little bit when I was growing up. I'm not a super fan, but they've debated which one of these characters with their ring, the power from their ring, is the most powerful. And so with these rings, they could do things with these elements, with water and all these things, but there was a guy that came along to help them, make them a little more powerful as they would need it, and he created 5 gauntlets for them to wear, 5 metal gloves that they would wear. And this would enhance their powers, and with those stronger powers, they could call up multiple F5 tornadoes and earthquakes that could crack the earth and do all these different things, tidal waves that could, tsunamis that would be taller than skyscrapers and all these things. You can imagine what they could do with these rings and certainly with the gauntlet. But there was one character, and he is on the right, on the far right, and his name is Mati, and his power was the power of heart. But Mati would never wear the gauntlet, because Zarm told him that if he were to wear the gauntlet with the power of heart, he would be able to control the minds and the hearts of every living creature on the earth. That is, people, animals, anything. So politicians, armies, the rich, the poor, important leaders, kings and queens, animals from tigers to sharks. He would be able to control their hearts and their minds. He would be unstoppable. He could shape the world in any way that he wanted it to go. That's why I believe, if I were a super fan, I would say Mati's power is probably the most powerful of all the Planeteers. Well, I don't want to do a whole lesson about the Planeteers and Captain Planet, I promise you. But that does bring us to our discussion tonight. And that is that Jesus wants to control our hearts. He wants to have control of our hearts. Not in a forced way, not by wearing an iron gauntlet or some kind of gauntlet that he could just call up anything you wanted to in our minds and we would have to obey. But he wants us to give ourselves to him voluntarily. So tonight, I want us to talk about the heart of Jesus. And I want us to look at 5 characteristics of the heart of Jesus. And my prayer is that as we study this tonight, that we will take on these characteristics ourselves, that we will become these 5 things. So, Jesus was 33 years old when he died. We understand that. Yet he's the greatest example of servanthood that the world has probably ever seen. And maybe not in the sheer amount of good things that he was able to do through being a servant, because, again, he was only 33 years old. There are people that have lived much longer than him that did a lot of good things. Of course, we will never know how many things he did as a servant. John 13 records one of his most well-known acts of servanthood when he washed the apostles' feet, and that's probably a very familiar story to most of us. I want to observe 3 reasons, or 3 things that Christ was motivated by in serving others in this story. One is because he knew he was going to the Father. He knew that he was going to the Father. John 13:1 says, knowing his hour had come. That's kind of in the beginning of that story of Jesus washing the apostles' feet. Knowing his hour had come. Now, if you look at the first 12 chapters of John, John doesn't say anything like that. In fact, he says his hour had not come. Over and over again, when you read through the first 12 chapters of John, his hour had not come. His hour had not come. And then chapter 13, knowing his hour had come. And that's significant. And so I believe that this whole event needs to be seen with that in mind. That as Christ knew what was waiting for him shortly, the crucifixion, he served others. That's what was on his mind. But that's not what the text says Jesus is focused on primarily. It says he knew he was going to the Father. And I have to believe that it's with this focus that helped him deal with what was to come. And not be overwhelmed by the crucifixion that was coming. He wasn't quite finished teaching. And without the right mindset, he could have easily given up. Well, the second motivation is that he loved them completely. It also says in verse 1 that Christ loved his own to the end. And if you do a little word study on that word end, there's another definition that can be given, which is completely. And so when we keep that in mind, he loved his own with a complete love, and that he fulfilled that love to the very end. And we'll talk about love a little bit later. And then the third motivation for Christ's servanthood is that he knew who he was. He knew who he was. How often is it that we know something, but we don't act on it? We know we have talents, or we know we have a certain knowledge about the Bible, but we don't act on it, or we tell ourselves that we can't. And Christ knew something, and he believed, and he acted on that knowledge. He knew the Father had given all things to him in his hands, Ephesians 1:22, and so he felt like he had an obligation. He knew he had an obligation. He knew he had come from God, and he knew that he was going back to God. And he wasn't dependent on anyone else except for God the Father, and therefore wasn't worried about the opinions of anyone but the Father. So I wonder tonight, do we ignore that knowledge? Do we ignore the potential that we might have in ourselves when it comes to being servants of God? And we say, well, I feel like I've got this talent, but maybe I just don't need to use it, or maybe I just can't use it, or I don't know how to use it. But think about the good that we could do for others and how we could lead others to him by stepping out of that comfort zone and stepping out on a limb and saying, I'm going to use my talent. I don't know how I'm going to apply it yet, but I'm going to use that talent. I'm going to try to reach people. And hopefully we'll see some of those things coming out this week as we're working for the community. Compassion in Merriam-Webster's dictionary is defined as sympathetic consciousness of others' distress together with the desire to alleviate it. Now that's kind of wordy, I understand. But basically that is to have compassion for someone is to be moved to your core for the sake of someone else, and a deep concern for that, and a desire to try to change. Jesus was having what we might call a bad day. A bad day. He had just received word that his cousin and his friend John the Baptist had just been murdered to fulfill a very shallow promise. Jesus, though he was God, was also human, and he had human emotions. He responded to this news much like any of us would respond to this type of news. He wanted to be by himself. He wanted to be alone. He wanted to be secluded and just get away from it all. Matthew tells us in chapter 14, verse 13, that when he heard about it, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And I know that we've all been in that situation, right? We've all gone through things in our lives, and we thought, I just want to get away. I need a night, I need a day, I need a few hours to just get away from all of this and clear my head. But when it comes to Jesus, the people just would not give him his time of mourning. They wanted to be right there where he was, understandably. Matthew also tells us that when the people heard of this, they followed him on foot from their cities. So the crowds were following him, and he just wanted to get away. He wanted to process the loss that he had just experienced. So what was Jesus to do? You know, what's he going to do? He knows who he is. He cares for these people. I guess that he could have sent Peter and James to tell the masses that he was taking the day off, and he would have been just by doing that. He could have done that. He could have asked John to let them know he was indisposed. But again, Matthew tells us how Jesus responds. Matthew 14, the next verse in verse 14, says, when he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and felt compassion for them. And he healed their sick. Jesus shows a great example of putting the needs of others before his own in a great move of compassion. Sometimes our hearts are very hard as a result of hurts and betrayal and selfishness and many other things. And Jesus wants to soften those hearts that love God into hearts that love God and make his love known to the world, even when we're having a bad day. Even when we're having a bad day. He shows a great example of someone who has compassion. Even as he was mourning the death of a family member and friend, Jesus noticed, responded to, and invested in the needs of others. So, what did Jesus think when he saw the crowds following him? Obviously, we can't know exactly. We can't get into the mind of Jesus exactly and know, but we do know some things for certain that were on his mind. First of all, he saw the need for the sick to be healed. We're told that when he saw the crowd, he had compassion on them and he healed their sick. And so Jesus didn't just push them aside and ignore them and say, "You're not welcome. I can't deal with this right now. I've got too much going on." He had compassion on them, and he went to them first. We also see that he saw a need for the people to eat. It had gotten late in the day, and the people were hungry, and the disciples, they said, "Send the people away and let him go home and get something to eat." But yet, Jesus had compassion on them, and he found some food, and we know what happened there. Jesus fed the crowds. And then there was a spiritual need that Jesus saw, and he filled it. In Mark's account of this story, we're told that Jesus taught them many things, and that was just the kind of person that Jesus was. He was moved to his core on behalf of the people. He had a desire to do something about it when he saw a need. But this isn't the only time that we see Jesus full of compassion. We look in Mark chapter 1 and verse 41, we find a man with leprosy, and we're told that Jesus was moved with compassion, and then he reached out and he touched his hand and he healed him. In Luke chapter 7 verse 13, there's a woman whose son had died, and it says when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and he gave the young man his life again. And then again in Mark chapter 5 verse 19, we find the story of Legion when they get off the boat, and there's a man there, and he's got these demons. He's possessed by these demons, Legion, and Jesus casts Legion out of this man. And Jesus tells the man to go to his friends, and then it says, "And show how the Lord has had compassion on you." And then in one of the most well-known parables, Jesus teaches compassion. The Good Samaritan. There's a man beaten, left on the side of the road to die. And as we know, the story goes, a priest sees him and passes by on the other side of the road. A Levite comes by, and he sees the man, and he passes him on the other side of the road. Those two men, by the way, would have been respected by the Jews. And then as the story goes, the Samaritan, who would not have been respected by the Jews, sees the man, takes him and puts him on his animal and takes him to the inn and offers to pay for anything that needs to be done to help him be healed from his wounds. Now, why does Jesus tell that story? It's because he wants people to live like that man, because Jesus had compassion as well. And so you could say that Jesus doesn't just talk the talk when it comes to compassion, but he also walks the walk. Now, how about us? You know, when was the last time we were moved with compassion, when we saw the needs of other people and had a heart of desire to want to help and change that person's life? Hopefully it wasn't too long ago, and hopefully we'll show a lot of compassion this week, certainly. If there's a character of heart that we could use a little more of, it's patience, right? Patience is not tailgating that person that just cut you off in traffic. Patience is not going inside and yelling at somebody in a fast food restaurant when they get your order wrong in the drive-through line, right? We have to have patience in those circumstances. Patience is waiting with grace. Waiting with grace. And I love the way that Isaiah describes a patient person, those who wait for the Lord. He says, "Those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength, and they shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Now, we understand life doesn't always go as planned, right? If this is in agreement, yeah, up and down, this is no. Lonnie Jones will say this is maybe. So I think we all understand that life doesn't always go as planned. And whether it's people or circumstances, we can sometimes lose our cool. But those who wait for the Lord, for help, they'll be blessed. Patience is an important heart characteristic for us to practice. It certainly is one that Jesus had. Put yourself in Jesus' shoes for a moment. Close your eyes if you need to, but just put yourself in Jesus' shoes. Since childhood, you've known where you have come from, and you know where you're going. As an adult, you surrounded yourself with men who had a heart for God. You spend your days teaching them and anyone else who will hear about God's love and mercy and forgiveness and kindness, and certainly about the kingdom. You heal those who need it. You feed those who need it. You help people see the error of their ways. To help with unbelief, you perform miracles, most of which are done with the purpose of helping people. And because of it all, because you do all these things, you're threatened, you're made fun of, rejected, beaten, spit upon, whipped, and forced to die an extremely painful death. It doesn't seem fair. Where would your breaking point be? Where would your breaking point be? Would you have made it past the threats without lashing back? Would you make it through the teasing without exacting revenge on someone? Would you stay patiently focused on your mission while being whipped? That's exactly what Jesus did. Let's look again at the text that was read earlier, 1 Peter chapter 2. And we'll start in verse 20 and read through 24. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed a bunch of sin? No. He committed no sin. Neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sin in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. What a great passage. What a great passage. We find here one of the greatest injustices of all time. And that is that Jesus bore our sins so that we could live to righteousness. Notice verse 23. When he was reviled, and that basically means when he was attacked, he did not revile in return when he suffered. And he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Jesus waited patiently for the Father because, first of all, he knew that people really didn't know what they were doing. We see that when he's on the cross and he's talking about the soldier. And he also knew what had to be done. You know, and maybe he always knew. I don't know. Maybe as a teenager he knew what was going to happen. Maybe he found out later on in life. We do know that before he went to the cross, he wept about it. He wept about it. His spiritual side was willing, although his flesh didn't want to suffer it. His spirit was willing because he knew there was no other way. But also he knew that the Father was a righteous judge. So he knew that it was all going to be okay in the end. Peter says he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. So Jesus had patience through the worst moments in life because he put his hands and his life in the hands of a righteous judge. So as we desire to have the heart of patience, we too need to put our lives in the hands of the same Father that Jesus put his life in the hands of. And trust that his judgment on those of the world supersedes my revenge or act of impatience and wanting, things before they need to happen and waiting on the Lord. And certainly his justice is going to be greater than anything we could ever come up with on our own. Well, now let's talk about love a little bit. We'd be here all day if I went through all of the songs with love in the title that were about love that I could think of. We'd be here for a very long time. But the world has always been fascinated with the idea of love. We like to receive love. We like to share our love, and so we have a fascination with it, and rightfully so. It's one of the greatest most powerful things ever. The following is not new with me, but I think it's worth sharing and certainly thought-provoking, so bear with me as I read this. What if for one day Jesus were to become you? What if for 24 hours Jesus wakes up in your bed, walks in your shoes, lives in your house, and assumes your schedule? Your boss is his boss. Your mother becomes his mother. Your pains become his pains. With one exception, nothing about your life changes. Your health doesn't change. Your circumstances don't change. Your schedule isn't altered. Your problems aren't solved. Only one change does occur. Your heart gets the day off, and your life is led by the heart of Christ. His priorities govern your actions. His passions drive your decisions. His love directs your behavior. What would you be like? What would you be like? Would people notice a change? Would your family see something new? Would your coworkers or your classmates sense a difference? What about the less fortunate? Your friends, your enemies, the sick? Would you treat any of them any differently if the heart of Jesus was ruling your life? Pause and think about your obligations, your appointments, and how would you feel personally? How would you feel? What changes would this have on your stress level, on your mood swings, your temper? Would you eat differently? Would you sleep differently? Or would you even be doing what you'd planned on doing for the next 24 hours? With Jesus taking over your heart, would anything really change? God's plan for us is that we have a heart transplant. Not a physical heart transplant, but a physical one. A spiritual one. A spiritual heart transplant. He wants us to become new people in Christ. And that involves having a heart of love like Jesus. Christ revealed his love in many, many different ways, healing those who needed healing, bringing life to those who had died, spending time with children, breaking social barriers, and all these things he did out of love. The one motivating factor was love. But the love of Jesus is shown in no greater way than laying down his life intentionally for us. Intentionally. He meant to. He did it on purpose. And that's the greatest act of love that he ever showed anybody. 1 John 3:16, which ironically echoes John 3:16, but 1 John 3:16 says, "By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers." Those who are different than us, those who disagree with us, those who might seek to do us harm. So if Christ was willing to lay down his life for us, the world, those who loved him and those who hated him, then shouldn't we also have a heart of love as Jesus did? And then finally tonight, in 1937, a young lady named Amelia Earhart attempted the longest ever round-the-world flight. She made it to New Guinea in 21 days, but never took to her next destination. Never made it to her next destination. 81 years later, we're still searching for any remnants of Amelia Earhart, the lost aviator. In 2014, Malaysia Airline Flight 370, along with 239 lives, mysteriously went missing. And 4 years later, we still don't have all the answers, though I think some debris has been found. But as recent as a few months ago, there was a U.S. company still searching for the lost ship and its passengers. Think about the hours, the days, the months, the years that we have searched for the lost. People away from families, teachers away from their students, servicemen and women unable to serve, parents away from their children. It's really sad. We value being together. We value not being separated from the people that we love. We have a problem in this world, and that's that millions are outside of Christ. Millions outside of Christ. They're lost, bound for an eternity, separated from their families, the people that they love, separated from God. Do we have a heart for those outside of Christ? While searching for those lost in the woods and the oceans and the mountains is very important, how much more so should it be that we seek out those who are lost spiritually and lead them to Christ? Nobody can question the heart of Christ when it comes to the lost. Luke 19:10, Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Peter tells us in 2 Peter 3:9, "The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any would perish, but that all should come to repentance." In Luke chapter 15, Jesus tells three parables. He tells the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. And in each one of those parables, he places great value on one thing that is lost. That's a lost soul. That's the point of the parables. So Jesus' ministry wasn't about making a name for himself or showing out because he was the Son of God. He never did that. It was about reaching the lost. We each have a ministry. And we've got to decide what our ministry in our lives is about. Is it about making a name for ourselves? Is it about getting tons of people to like us? We talked about that this morning with social media. Is it about impressing people with our Bible knowledge? And certainly many of the people in this room could do that. Or is it about reaching the lost with the gospel of Christ? Even if we have compassion, patience, love, we'll never have the heart of Jesus if we don't have those things and use those things towards saving the lost. If we don't apply that towards saving the lost, we'll never fully have the heart of Jesus. So tonight, I ask a simple question in closing. How is your heart? How is your heart? Do you have the heart of Jesus? And hopefully, as we've gone through this lesson, you've kind of been thinking about your life and your heart a little bit. And so tonight, as we do every time we have a lesson, we offer an invitation. And it's called an invitation because we invite you. We invite you to respond any way that you need to. Whether that is to put Christ on in baptism, to obey the plan of salvation, to follow God and be born again, or as a Christian, to realize some things about your life that are amiss and take an honest look at ourselves and say, you know what, I really need prayers in this area because I've been lacking. And there's nothing shameful about that. That's one of the strongest things you could ever do is admit a wrong and make it right. And so we're going to have a song. And so we invite you, if you have a need, come while we stand and as we sing.